Hi class, welcome to the lecture on protein, chapter 7. Why is protein important? There are so many functions of protein. It's really vital to life. So I'm going to bring them up here and then we're going to discuss them later on. It's important for fluid balance, regulating acidity, that is the acidity of your blood, the pH level in your blood, structure. The most obvious thing to think of is muscles, but also bone, collagen, skin, hair, nails, pretty much everything that our body's composed of. Movement, enzymes, proteins that can speed up metabolic reactions. Transportation, proteins serve as transport molecules. A good example is hemoglobin that can transport oxygen. Protection, I mentioned skin already, but skin is our biggest organ and also our first line of protection against pathogens, also antibodies and hormones. So we're going to talk about these coming up through the lecture. Structure of protein. Protein is made of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So the nitrogen part of protein is what makes it pretty different from carbs and fat. Remember, carbs and fat do not contain nitrogen. Some proteins contain sulfur, and proteins are groups of structures. Each structure is called an amino acid. So amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. Amino acids are supplied by our diet. So when we eat both plants and animals, we can get amino acids. And we're going to see a picture of amino acids coming up, but they are named for the chemical structure. Amine group is a group that has a nitrogen, and an acid group is a certain arrangement of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, which makes an acid. So we're going to see this coming up. So this is a picture of a generic amino acid. And what you see is you have the amino group, the NH2, you have the acid or carboxyl group, COOH, and then you have a hydrogen coming off of the carbon and an R group. That R group can be many different things, and depending on what that R group is, determines which amino acid the chemical structure matches. So in the simplest amino acid, which is glycine, that R group is just a hydrogen. A step above that would be alanine, where the R group is a methyl group, which is a CH3. But it's possible for R groups to be ring structures or to be branch structures. And depending on the structure of the R group, it can determine how that amino acid works in our body. The body needs 20 amino acids to function. However, we can produce some of these ourselves. 11 of them we can produce ourselves. 9 of them are considered essential, meaning we cannot produce them ourselves. We have to get them from diet. It's possible for a protein, or specifically an amino acid, to become conditionally essential. And a good example of this is tyrosine. Our body uses the amino acid phenylalanine to make tyrosine. So as long as we have phenylalanine, we can make plenty of tyrosine. But if we didn't have phenylalanine, tyrosine would be conditionally essential. There are certain genetic disorders. One is called PKU, or phenylketonuria. And this is a genetic disorder that not only makes tyrosine essential, but also causes phenylalanine to build up. In this genetic disorder, people are low in an enzyme that converts phenylalanine to tyrosine. So phenylalanine can build up to toxic levels, and tyrosine ends up deficient. Amino acid composition. So we can get our amino acids from both animal and plant proteins. All animal proteins are complete except for gelatin. So gelatin you would not want to try to survive on. Gelatin is low in tryptophan. And most animal proteins, because they do have all of these 9 essential amino acids, are considered complete or high quality. They also have these 9 essential amino acids in kind of proportions that the human body uses. Plant proteins, except for quinoa and soy, do not necessarily have all of the 9 essential amino acids or might be low in one. And they're classified as incomplete. But I have this big question here. What? Because newer thought is actually trying to say that incomplete versus complete are very inaccurate terms. And plant proteins can actually be very complete as long as we eat plant proteins in variety, meaning we mix up which plant proteins we have during the day or during the week. There are plenty of amino acids throughout plant proteins that can get us everything we need. So the terms incomplete and complete are pretty outdated, and this is a video that can explain some of the reasons why. In our bodies, we actually have a pool of essential amino acids. So if we're not eating them all every single day, our body is usually just fine. If we're eating a food that has an essential amino acid in a low amount or doesn't have it at all, that would be considered the limiting amino acid. And the reason this would be limiting is because you could use the amino acids to make protein up until that point where you might run out of one of them. And then you wouldn't be able to make protein anymore, but you would have to use those amino acids for energy or to create ATP. Common kind of old-timey practice was to say complementary proteins. And this again goes on the fact that they used to say that plants were considered incomplete proteins. So textbooks, nutrition experts, doctors, physicians used to say you must combine your proteins together when you're eating plant products in order to get all the essential amino acids you need. But what we know is that actually if you eat a variety of plants throughout the day, throughout the week, you will do just fine because, like we said up front, your body has a pool of these essential amino acids it can draw from. So if you eat a plant that might be low in one of them, that's okay because your body has some in storage. Traditionally speaking, however, like I said, it was recommended to combine plant products to get a complete protein. Legumes are low in methionine and tryptophan. Nuts are low in lysine, and grains are low in lysine. However, nuts, seeds, and grains have methionine and tryptophan. So if you combine these together, you can get all of the amino acids you need. How do we make proteins? So proteins are made by combining multiple amino acids together. And amino acids are connected by what's called a peptide bond. When a peptide bond forms, water is given off because 2 hydrogen molecules as well as 1 oxygen are no longer needed. And like the naming of other macronutrients we've talked about, it has to do with how many are in these chains. So di is going to mean 2, tri 3, oligo 4 to 9, and poly 10 or more. Most polypeptides, however, have 5 to 2,000 amino acids in them. So they're actually quite much bigger than 10 or more. How are proteins made? So in our body, DNA codes for protein synthesis. DNA is the instructions that tell our bodies how to arrange these amino acids. So DNA has coded instructions for protein synthesis and determines which amino acids are placed where and in what order. And DNA will allow us to form polypeptides or long chains of amino acids, which you can kind of see in this very last figure that's labeled D. A polypeptide is forming, or a long chain of amino acids. Once a polypeptide has formed, it will actually twist and fold to form a 3D structure, which will end up being the intended protein. So this diagrams how proteins become their 3D structure. You start with a primary protein, which is really just a string or a polypeptide of amino acids. It then twists into its secondary structure. Thirdly, it becomes its 3D structure or tertiary structure. And then a quaternary structure is actually made of multiple tertiary structures of proteins. And this particular quaternary structure is hemoglobin, which we use to carry oxygen. The organization of amino acids to form polypeptides, as well as secondary, tertiary, and quaternary protein shape, is very, very precise, very, very specific, and very important. If just a single amino acid is out of place, it's possible for catastrophic effects to happen. And the example given here is in the form of hemoglobin. So we just saw how hemoglobin is usually shaped. It's kind of this round disc-like shape made out of 4 tertiary structures, and that's shown in B. However, if there is an error in the genetic code and instead of a glutamate, there is a valine, or instead of a glutamic acid, there is a valine amino acid that forms, the hemoglobin cell is completely abnormal. And there's a profound change in the structure. It's this sickle shape. These sickle shapes can't carry oxygen very well. They're hard and sticky. They get stuck inside of our very small capillaries. They can break. And eventually accumulation of them can lead to paralysis, headaches, shortness of breath, and eventually death. The disease that is named for this is called sickle cell anemia, and it is relatively rare, but still 70,000 to 100,000 people are affected, primarily of African American or Hispanic descent. So the organization and sequence of proteins is very, very important. Protein denaturation happens when the protein structure is broken. And most protein denaturation is irreversible. Once you break apart the structure, you can't put it back together. Things I like to think about are eggs, because eggs are protein. When you fry an egg, you completely change that structure, and you can't ever reverse that. When you whip egg whites to make like meringue or to make peaks to use in baking, you can't ever reverse that process because you've broken that tertiary structure. So proteins can be denatured by many different things: acid or alkaline solutions, enzymes, heat, and agitation. Where do we get protein? So obviously we get protein from foods. However, we actually break down a lot of our own proteins in our body, and we don't just get rid of all those amino acids because that would cause us having to eat more and more protein every day. We recycle quite a few of them. So we recycle a lot of the proteins we break down. As far as proteins consumed go, in the North American diet, we consume 70% from meat, poultry, fish, milk, cheese, legumes, and nuts. And worldwide, this number is a lot less as far as animal products go. In the world, plant protein is more predominant. However, there have been shifts both in the US and worldwide, which are actually opposite. So in the US, the consumption of meat has significantly gone down. We eat 25% less beef and 12% less meat overall. However, worldwide, meat consumption has doubled and milk consumption has also significantly increased. These are just some sample sources of protein, both animal and vegetable sources, or vegetarian, plant-based sources. What are other options besides what we traditionally think of as meats? So obviously these are bugs here. And I know in the United States, eating bugs is very taboo. However, it's been estimated that 30% of the world, 7 billion with a B, people eat bugs as part of their normal diet. And why would they do this? First of all, bugs are very prevalent. They're easy to reproduce. They have a very short reproductive life. They're very efficient. They require less food, 12 times less than beef, for example. They require less storage space, and they produce less greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see here, I have insects, seafood, traditional meat, and other sources, almonds, eggs, and tofu, compared as far as proteins per 100 grams of the product. And some of the insect sources are just as high as the traditional meat sources. So why not eat them? I challenge you to give it a try. They sell insect protein bars, insect powders, insect brownies, barbecued insects, all sorts of different insect products you can try. Other sources of protein. So these are protein supplements, and generally protein supplements are made from a mixture of amino acids. However, if they are ever made from singular amino acids, there is some risk there. Our body is not meant to deal with singular amino acids. We're meant to handle whole proteins. And so when individual amino acids are taken, they can overwhelm our absorptive mechanisms, and this can cause imbalances in our intestinal tract. For example, lysine and arginine both compete for the same receptors, so if we take them both individually, the absorption will be impaired of both of them, and it can cause some bad side effects. Selling single amino acids is actually banned in other countries, Canada, for example. So when you are buying these proteins, look for whole protein sources. Vegetarian diets. So vegetarian diets are non-meat, non-animal-based diets. However, there are some variation to what type of vegetarian diet you might have. And here I even say you might include dairy, eggs, or fish. So we'll see that coming up. Per gram of protein, plants provide more magnesium, fiber, folate, vitamin E, iron, and increased vitamin C, and sometimes even more calcium than animal sources. Also, they're lower in saturated fat and cholesterol, and they're high in fiber, so why not? Okay, so think of reasons why to follow a vegetarian diet and how you might convince somebody to. These are types of vegetarian diets for your review. Like I said, there are all sorts of vegetarian diets. It really is a spectrum of vegetarianism. Some people eat no animal products whatsoever, don't even use animal products in their lifestyle. And other people consider themselves vegetarian, however, eat things like fish or eggs or cheese or different dairy products. So it is quite a spectrum, and you can read over these yourself. Here's some more. And then issues or potential issues with a vegetarian diet. Since some proteins are found in higher concentrations in animal products, there are some potential deficiencies with a vegetarian diet if you're not planning very well. Vegetarian diets can absolutely be followed safely and are absolutely adequate for any person, any life stage, as long as that person is educated on what nutrients are important and has the means to buy them, prepare them, cook them, etc. So in a case that somebody was not planning very well, they may fall deficient in some of these nutrients: B12, vitamin D, riboflavin, iron, calcium, and zinc. Vegetarian sources of protein. So I just have a few pictures here, but there are many meat substitutes out there on the market. There's something called seitan, and this is a food made from whole wheat gluten. They actually wash the flour until the starch part is removed and the gluten is left, and it's supposed to be kind of sticky and stringy and taste very meat-like. There's multiple vegetarian type burgers. Top right is TVP. This is textured vegetable protein. This is usually made of soy and can be added to recipes such as pasta sauce or tacos. And then bottom right is tempeh, which is a fermented soy product. What to consider when you are choosing protein. There are many, many considerations that you might want to use to decide what you're going to eat. Here I have a picture of carbon footprint, and this represents greenhouse gas emissions produced by growing, rearing, farming, transporting, storing, cooking, and disposing of the food you eat. So it really can be compared to the exhaust from your car or how many miles of car you've driven. Here you see lamb is the highest, tomato the lowest on their chart. I have some comparisons as far as eating a pound of meat versus driving your car. Eating a pound of lamb would be the carbon equivalent of driving your car 93 miles, beef 63 miles, cheese 31, chicken 16, eggs 11, rice 6, nuts 5, vegetables 4.5, milk 4, lentils 2, fruit 2.5. So you can see that when we get away from meat, the carbon impact is not as high. There are ethical implications. Perhaps you're concerned about animal welfare, cost considerations, and other considerations. Maybe you want to, choose free range or cage free or all natural or certified humane or something like that when you're choosing your proteins. How to evaluate quality of proteins. So quality of protein evaluates its ability to support growth, and it's usually compared to a reference protein, which would be able to support the growth of a young child's development. And we can determine it by how well we can digest a food, as well as which amino acids are in it. Plant proteins have a higher digestibility score. Usually we can digest these 90 to 99%. Vegetable proteins are closer to 70 to 90%. Biological value is one measure we use to measure protein efficiency, and this measures how well we can absorb it into the body and utilize it to make new tissue. We use egg white here as our reference protein, and compared to egg white, most proteins are pretty high. However, most plants are pretty low. And this is true. If we just ate a single plant protein source, it would be inadequate. However, the point of vegetarian diets and just good health in general is to eat variety and moderation. So when we are eating variety and moderation, the total biological value could potentially be better. Nitrogen balance. This is another way to assess somebody's protein status. Proteins are nitrogen-containing foods, and so when we eat them, we consume nitrogen. When we excrete them via our feces, our sweat, our urine, even our skin, our hair, and our nails, we're losing nitrogen. And our body cells are constantly being turned over. Our body proteins are. So nitrogen balance can measure how much nitrogen you're taking in versus how much you are taking out. And these are some examples of when nitrogen balance might be considered negative versus when it might be considered positive. Negative nitrogen balance means you're losing more than you're taking in. Positive nitrogen balance means you are taking in more than you are losing. Here again are some pictures of what state you might be in at a certain time for nitrogen balance. So how much protein can we eat or should we eat? The AMDR for protein is 10 to 35%, so that's actually a pretty big range. The RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilo. And I do want you to know how to calculate this, so we will see some examples coming up. This is usually the amount needed for a normal, healthy person. However, certain conditions, somebody might need more. For example, pregnancy, lactation, when they're sick, if they had burns, infections, or for very, very highly trained athletes. So how do we start to digest these proteins? Just like we start to digest the carbs and the fats, we cook them. Cooking softens them, helps break them up, and then we chew them. Chewing them exposes the surfaces of proteins to enzymes, so when they hit our stomach, more surfaces are exposed. The most digestion of protein begins in our stomach, and that starts with hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid can denature protein, and pepsin will break down long polypeptide chains into shorter amino acids or single amino acids. After the stomach, the protein will enter the small intestine, or the protein mixed with the chyme will enter the small intestine, and this will trigger the release of hormones. One of the hormones is CCK, or cholecystokinin, which causes the pancreas to secrete proteases such as trypsin and trypsinogen, and these further will break down proteins. Once proteins are broken down, they can be absorbed through the intestinal cells and transported via the portal vein to the liver. And in the liver, they can be used for protein synthesis or energy needs. So this is just a summary of protein digestion and absorption. And an additional summary of what happens in the liver: amino acids are taken up by absorptive cells in the lining of the small intestine and then transported to the liver. So I mentioned we would get back to functions of protein. So here they are in a little bit more detail. Protein is essential for structures of our body. And this is a very important example here. This is actually some bone structure. So protein helps form bone. It also helps form collagen, actin, and myosin, which are important for muscle contractions. It helps form blood clotting factors, transport proteins, lipoproteins, connective tissue, enzymes, and we're always degrading this protein in our body, and so we must consume more daily. Protein is important for maintaining fluid balance. Protein within the vessels helps hold fluid in the vessels, so that fluid doesn't seep out into the extracellular space. If we're very low on protein, fluid can actually seep out into the extracellular space, or if our blood pressure is really high, our protein isn't adequate. And when this happens, something called edema occurs, which is literally fluid leaking out of our cells into our extracellular space, or leaking out of our capillaries. And this can be very, very unpleasant, very kind of awkward, in some cases painful. And this happens because fluid builds up because the force produced by the proteins is too weak to pull the fluid back into the tissues. Additional functions of proteins. I mentioned that proteins would help with acid-base balance, and proteins have a negative charge, so they're able to attract positively charged hydrogens and serve as hydrogen acceptors, thereby being able to adjust the pH balance. Because remember, pH is negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. So pH is directly related to hydrogen ions. Proteins can make very many, very, very vital and important kind of systems or helpers to our body. They make hormones, chemical messengers, enzymes, which can speed up reactions, and neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, which are used in our brain. The example here is a hormone called insulin, which is vital to blood glucose control. Proteins also contribute to immune function, and this is an antibody. So proteins are responsible for creating antibodies. If we did not have sufficient dietary proteins, we would not be able to form antibodies, and our immune system would be very weak. Proteins can serve as transport carriers. For example, within a cell membrane, there might be a protein channel, which can allow different things to pass. They may also carry products throughout the blood, such as hemoglobin. Other examples are retinol binding protein. It carries vitamin A. Ceruloplasmin carries copper, and transferrin and ferritin can carry iron. If we have excessive protein and no carbohydrate, it is possible to break down protein to convert to glucose, and that process is called gluconeogenesis. And I hope you remember how many calories protein has. I'm not even going to tell you. Protein energy malnutrition. This is something that's very sad, but relatively common worldwide. And this can happen when people have energy malnutrition, meaning not enough calories, and protein malnutrition, meaning not enough protein, or just a protein malnutrition. Protein energy malnutrition. So the first type of this is called kwashiorkor. And this is where you see mild energy, meaning calories, mild to moderate calorie depletion, however, severe protein depletion. So these children do still have a little bit of body fat. However, you see in their bellies, they have this edema, and that's because they don't have enough protein to hold the fluid in the correct places. It's also because their livers kind of develop a fatty condition and potentially can enlarge. Some of these babies can be treated, and with proper nutrition, it can reverse. The second type of protein energy malnutrition is marasmus, and marasmus is a severe energy, meaning calorie malnutrition, as well as a severe protein malnutrition. So these poor babies are not getting enough calories or enough protein, and really they are just unfortunately slowly starving. They have this skin and bone appearance, not much fat. They don't respond much. I mean, they don't even cry when you pick them up. They're just really, really, really not thriving, doing very poorly. And if caught early enough, this also can be fixed, but sometimes there's long-term deficits, for example, stunting of growth or stunting of cognitive development. This is a chart that compares the two. So what about high-protein diets? These have become more trendy, especially with some of the fad diets out there and potentially with some athletes. And the worry with a high-protein diet is it might lead to increased urinary calcium losses. This has been shown by some studies. And if you're losing calcium, the only place you're going to get calcium to lose is from your bones. So potentially this could lead to weaker bones. There is some worry that high-protein diets will stress your kidneys because the kidneys have to break down protein. Also, they have done studies on people with kidney disease, and people with kidney disease on lower protein diets tend to fare better. Protein allergies. So when people have food allergies, true food allergies, what they're actually allergic to is proteins in the foods. And there are 8 foods that are most likely to elicit an allergic response in people, and these are actually right here. Peanuts and tree nuts, such as almonds and walnuts, and cashews, milk or dairy products, eggs, fish, shellfish, and wheat, or usually specifically gluten. And about 8% of children and 2% of adults do have food allergies. So I believe that this is the last slide, and thank you for listening to Proteins. Hope you enjoyed.